She came to see me at Joan's with her friend Helen for a private session with me when I drew the images of their guardian angels and helpers and offered them a mini psychoanalysis. They were very pleased with the experience. I was not going to make anybody accept untrue assessments, believing that psychics always tell the truth. However, if what I said helped them, I was happy. Both friends lived nearby, and I was told Helen was also conducting a meditation program. That interested me a lot and was not disappointed when I visited her group. Later, I met their relatives and drew the image of a guide for Helen's granddaughter, which I believe she valued and has kept. About this time, Rosemarie explained she had been adhering to a development circle with Joan King, and in a different group they were conducting an experiment in a darkened room to have a brass trumpet move from one corner of the table to the other with the assistance of spirit guides or spirit beings for a long time. So far nothing had happened, but one day, after meeting Rosemarie and doing some shopping, I told her that when they met next time, after all those years of waiting, the trumpet was going to move, much to the surprise of the participants. She was not surprised, knowing that we had successfully conducted mind-over-matter experiments at Joan's and have been able to impress images on photographic film, although people like Wendy had been very critical of me. Rosemarie was convinced that what I had told her would happen. I told her to be prepared to be surprised. It did. According to Rosemarie, the trumpet made an extraordinary jump into the air and landed elsewhere, causing great excitement. I had attended one of their meetings a long time before, and was very surprised about the attitude of people eagerly and faithfully waiting for it to happen for all those years. Interestingly, although Rosemarie had not told her, when I met Joan King much later, she was not very happy with me, saying, "Now you have done what you have done. You finished that experiment. We cannot continue with it any longer." When Rosemarie decided to join my meditation group, instead of going to the other, Joan King and her associates became very anti-me, or it came across like that. In reality, I had done nothing, perhaps just setting the ball rolling, creating the right kind of ripples to influence the focused object in question. It was not magic, for there is always a reasonable explanation for every physical event. On the other hand, John Connor's relatives, who had recently arrived from Ireland, were a little apprehensive about mind over matter and influencing photographic film from a distance. They would benefit from an experience involving them. One day, as they took family photos, I was able to impress several of my images on their films as double exposures, without having any physical contact with their camera and virgin films. They were surprised but could not explain the phenomena, while I was unsure how I had impressed my images without being completely aware of doing so, yet I felt the urge to apologize for ruining those photographs, but they took it as a harmless joke. In some of the images I appeared like a ghost, but still representing full color, and in others I was upside down at a very close range. I could not explain the situation, and concluded that perhaps someone had played a prank with me. Maybe my desire to be part of the experience had triggered the necessary elements, unexplainable by normal means at the time, was enough to cause those impressions. The very best thing for me was simply to take it as a jest and leave it at that. One other surprise was that a certain young lady often appeared next to me in those images, and I have no explanation as to who that could be, other than what Joan was eagerly theorizing. Probably the Virgin written about in the good book. On another occasion I found myself wandering the main street on an extremely stormy and rainy morning, far away from where I lived. I was not wearing my pyjamas, but what I normally dressed myself in at home, simple and light clothing. It felt cold and miserable, and I did not know how I happened to be closer Box Hill than my Springvale address, or the Noble Park area, where Joan and her family lived. I was not drunk, and took no habit-forming substances. I was certainly not abducted, and did not remember taking a stroll along the empty streets before retiring. In fact, I would not normally wander into distances far at night, because of known dangers lurking around the corner. Luckily, I had my mobile telephone in my pocket, although unsure if it would work from that distance, and whether its battery had sufficient power left, as such equipment was still in its infant stages. Very hesitantly I contacted Joan for help. After all, they had insisted that I should call them any time, if and when needed. Surprised, she asked how I ended up in Box Hill at that hour of the morning. She knew this was totally out of character, and that I would never do something like that, for it was illogical. And she asked if I had been sleepwalking. I had no idea about what had happened, other than a vague memory of descending in a park area in a dream. Besides, I did not remember going to bed and falling asleep. Maybe, I thought, I was losing my marbles after all the ugly experiences that I had finally cracked. Joan told me she was going to pick me up as soon as she could make it, and she could not miss me if I started to walk back. But it started to pour, with rain heavier, as if it was a heavenly jest. And when Joan finally arrived, a long time had passed, and I was thoroughly soaked and cold. When we arrived at Joan's, she offered me hot tea while everybody slept, and when I got home, I had to force one of the windows to gain entry because I did not have my keys with me. That alone was very unusual. I still have no idea what had happened that night. I had no idea how I ended up in Box Hill, for there were no trains or buses running at the time. I only had my phone, no money, and no house keys. Nothing made any sense. Again, one extremely early morning, I found myself waking up on top of the caravan in their backyard, and felt like an intruder. I used my mobile to call Joan. I was unsure how she would take it, but she was not stirred at all, only surprised that I was on top of their caravan, which was unoccupied at the time. I could have stayed there until sunrise, and then cautiously climbed down, but I was in shock. We had breakfast, and shortly after I walked to the nearby shopping center at what I nicknamed the Boat, Waverley Gardens. Joan and Wilbur were to meet me there for a cup of coffee. As we were sipping our coffees at Jim's coffee shop, Wilbur jokingly said that I either flew over to the caravan or our friends had dropped me there for some reason. Indeed, the only memory of the occasion was a glimpse of descending on top of the caravan, but I still had no explanation for how it happened. I certainly had not imbibed any alcohol, and wondered if I had an episode of sleepwalking. But had I? I continued to conduct those meditation groups for a while. During this time, I kept struggling with my day-to-day expenses, looking for suitable part-time employment, while lecturing in subjects I had majored in. My whole life had become like a huge educational entity, for I felt besieged by life's intriguing questions, which known religions and traditions did not have any answers for. Ancient philosophers came a little closer, and I remained a philosopher, not because of studying this wide-reaching science as an additional interest alone, but because of my endless questions. needing to comprehend the complex processes of the human mind and imaginings. Since there had to be fire when there was smoke, I wanted to know where that fire was. I wanted to value those treasures I collected on the roadside by sharing with others. Every human being gathers their own treasures, knowing that when shared they gain value and are appreciated. Those treasures are the life's experiences we all have, and the wisdom gained becomes priceless. I wanted to have no further contact with people who accused me of wrongdoing for no reason. I suppose they were punishing me by becoming vindictive for not fulfilling their ungrounded imaginings and empty hopes. I was not going to dance to their tune. I too am an individual. Being accepted and loved unconditionally by only a handful of genuine friends was enough for me. On occasions, I frequented so-called mind, body, and spirit festivals at the exhibition building in the city to draw inspired images for people who were so desperate in a world filled with grief. Seeing them happy was important to me. Although I got very little money from this activity, I always aimed to offer others quality, unlike some psychic artists with their imagined realities about people's past and their deceased relatives to make as much money as possible. I met a number of young Russians who were promoting the health benefits of purple metals and marketing a variety of crystals for meditative purposes. We became friendly, and they introduced me to their other friends who were of Jewish origin. We visited a Russian restaurant and listened to songs from all around the country, including Armenia. Later, we paid a visit to a crystal supplier and his shop in Brunswick. The Italian owner explained that he had a very spiritual meditation group and invited us to attend one of their meetings. John was very keen to meet me further to discuss important issues, as he put it. He was a small, dark-haired person and had a number of followers. When visiting them, my Russian friends, who were supposed to meet me there, did not come, and so I was the only one joining the group for the very first time. Many of the gathered were Italians, enabling me to practice my Italian language skills. They all took John very seriously. He was like a godfather to them. When the evening session started, John began to drift into a believable deep trance. The alleged spirit person taking over his body introduced himself as Jesus, the Son of God, and there fell complete silence. This Jesus spoke about world affairs, but extensively used several colorful expletives. The audience was not stirred by this, although it was most unusual and very annoying to hear the supposed Jesus speak the way John was channeling. Later, when the session was over, everybody kept praising how thoughtful and wise Jesus was, and what a genuine psychic John was. Obviously, this Jesus had chosen John as his spokesman and mediator. They enjoyed coffee and biscuits afterwards and invited me to attend the next wholesome session. A few weeks later, I was invited by the Brunswick Spiritualist Church to draw inspired portraits of people who were either past relatives or guardian angels of the congregation. How long it took did not matter for them, and I did so while speaking to them the way I was inspired. Reverend Madam President was not at all pleased, having a male bearded guide, for all her guides had to be female. They paid me a peppercorn sum and invited me to their services. What they explained about John was interesting, for he had apparently broken off from their church and started another one of his own. They were not in favor of him, believing that he was probably leaning towards Antichrist. Nothing made any sense, and I found that everything so far discovered was nothing other than fantasy, not based upon provable facts. John invited me for a private meeting at his workplace and showed me additional rooms where he had huge grotto-style carvings and sculpture. He spoke to me about his belief in world dominion and how people needed to be helped to have their curses removed. For the proper and effective removal of curses, the deserved fees and other necessary services had to be forthcoming to him. Apparently, people's problems were based on those curses, and when they came to him for consultation, they were encouraged to speak all about their ordeals and private thoughts openly. At the end of the session, money matters would be considered, and work would begin in earnest soon after. He mentioned that the service fees were based on the severity of the curses and suffering they might have caused. Before even I had explained to him about my educational background, he behaved as if he knew everything about me. For instance, telling me about my supposed South American ancestry and Russian connections, which he obviously fabricated. Since he could not detect any curses around me, he believed I was a great wizard, and surely I was cognizant with how to build a flying carpet, for he had seen me many times flying into all parts of the world in his visions. This was an entirely new revelation to me, and certainly born out of his imagination. Soon he started asking me to build a flying carpet for him, with all the important elements and signs from the Kabbalah and Clavicus Solomonis, so that we could fly together. He declared that he was going to appoint me as his assistant, and this way we could conquer the world. The situation I was evidently dealing with appeared a little too serious, and as I discovered after lengthy discussions with him, it could lead to more disastrous challenges. He told me that he trusted me in regard to building his flying carpet, and that I had the means to achieve it. I decided not to see him for a very long time, but when I did, he repeated his relentless demands for me to build his carpet, promising that we would both become very rich. I tried to explain to him the difficulties when attempting to build his vehicle he demanded, but one could not get through to him, let alone make him see that it was nothing more than a dream. He was absolutely obsessed with the idea that I was capable of building his flying carpet, and even piloted as his assistant. In his eyes, some evil people were influencing me not to proceed with this project due to their jealousies, for he was apparently always more successful in his undertakings. I never believed in what some people had made mention of, namely psychic attacks, but what I have experienced could not be explained. One evening, after returning home in Springvale, after a fun-filled day, feeling completely relaxed, content, I went to my slumber in the beautiful quiet of the night. My music system was turned off, and yet I started hearing someone talking to me. At first the voice whispered, saying, "What about my flying carpet?" which made me to jump out of my bed, needing to check if my entertainment unit was turned off. There was nothing on, and I thought I was probably dreaming. I turned the lights on and laid back. As I started to drift into a restful sleep, I heard the same voice speaking to me, saying the same words. What about my flying carpet? This time I got up and sat on the edge of my bed, thinking I must have been hallucinating. But the voice came back, repeating the same words. This time I was most certainly awake. Annoyed, I shouted that it was not possible to build it without the right materials. And why was I being targeted like this? Suddenly I thought that I was probably talking to the air or an imagined voice. I made a hot cup of tea and decided to settle back to sleep. A little while later, I heard the same ugly voice coming from my speakers very loudly. I jumped up and attempted to turn my entertainment unit off, but it was not turned on in the first place. I literally removed the connections from the back of my speakers. The voice once again came from them, but a lot louder, repeating the same words. My flying carpet. I felt frustrated, loudly shouting, "What do you want? Whoever or whatever you are, leave me alone, or give me the right materials, and I shall build it." Can you not see how impossible it is to create something like that, a fantasy? The answer came swiftly. But you can make anything possible. Give me my flying carpet. I answered, "You cannot ask me to create the impossible in this life and dimension. It is not available." The lights in the room started to flicker, and my bed started to move up and down, just like scenes in horror films. The whole situation might have been created in my imagination, but it felt extraordinarily real. Then I shouted as loudly as one could imagine, "You are nothing but an unreasonable thought energy, a nightmare, an ugly spirit, or whatever you might be. You have no power over me. Go back to your originator immediately." An unearthly voice cried, "You are hurting me. You are hurting me." A flash of light gradually diminishing. The voice drifted into the distance, never to be heard again, and my bed no longer shook. Finally, there was calm. My room was now like a war zone. Everything was thrown everywhere. Was this a dream? A nightmare, perhaps? Was I so much influenced by John that his demands were intruding into my dreams? Was that experience perhaps nothing more than a creation of my imaginative mind? I may have been fighting my own demons and succeeded in vanquishing them, for this experience never repeated. However, I still question if John had anything to do with the experience. Was he perhaps trying to curse me, like a number of so-called friends in the past? Did he have any knowledge of this incident, since it echoed his words? The experience I had was physically real to me, and not dreamt of. Was I under some kind of pressure and uncontrolled stress? I had no significant answers. However, I still could not accept curses and imagined circumstances as real. Sometimes unusual phenomena occur in the presence of teenagers who are probably generating currently unexplainable thought energies, but the validity of such claims could not be substantiated. Was I also generating similar energies unawares? I could only share the experience with very close friends, and not everybody. I was fearful of being considered what the world would normally theorize in regard to this situation, perhaps even classify me as unstable. They would probably advise me to seek medical assistance, or else consider exorcism by a religious authority. However, I believe that my condition was induced due to being under extreme pressure from every conceivable direction. In fact, I seriously considered seeing an independent psychiatrist if the situation persisted, but it did not. I was now even more determined to know what really triggered such not fully explainable phenomena. I thought one could borrow more books on the subject in question and consider other people's experiences. I was no longer going to associate with people who were only causing disharmony. I had no need for that. Every fear-based condition could be explained in psychological study. My condition was almost like overcoming the phobias of encountering snakes, arachnophobia, and the like. The best way to deal with the situation was, as always, by facing one's own fears and dealing with them. Occasionally, as mentioned before, I frequented mind, body, and spirit festivals to draw portraits as inspired, hoping to help my much-needed finances. Several times I did so with my Russian friends, who were promoting a few Russian inventions, but when we combined the supposedly shared expenses, they were the only ones profiting, while promising that next time I would also benefit from the shared stalls at those festivals. As a consequence, I decided to go solo from then on. In one of those festivals, I was approached by a couple of gentlemen of Jewish background, asking me if I knew the good artist Suren, for they apparently wanted to have inspirational portraits drawn by him depicting their guardian angels. Obviously influenced by New Age philosophies, spiritualism, or psychics, they were astounded to discover who Suren was, and were talking to him. One took my telephone number and said he was going to call me. From this point on, my traumas became even more unbearable and tragic. A Chinese proverb puts it so plainly: "The diamond cannot be polished without friction, nor the man perfected without trials."